In the small city of Riverdale, there were two youth orchestras that everyone knew about. The Westbrook Symphony Youth Orchestra practiced on the west side of town, in an old community hall with wooden floors that creaked when you walked on them. The East Side Philharmonic Youth Ensemble rehearsed in a modern building with big glass windows and air conditioning that actually worked. These two groups had been at war with each other for as long as anyone could remember. Now, when I say war, I don't mean they were fighting with fists or weapons. No, this was a different kind of battle. It was fought with violin bows and trumpet notes. It was waged in concert halls and at competition stages. And somehow, over the years, this musical rivalry had turned into something ugly. It all started about 12 years ago, during a regional music festival. Both orchestras were young back then, just getting started, and they were both hungry to prove themselves. The competition that year was close, too close. When the judges announced that Westbrook had won by just half a point, the East Side conductor stood up and accused the judges of being biased. Words were exchanged. Parents got involved. Local newspapers wrote about the drama. And just like that, a seed of hatred was planted. Every year after that, the rivalry grew worse. Students from Westbrook were taught to look down on East Side players. They called them show-offs who cared more about fancy techniques than real feeling in their music. Meanwhile, East Side students believed that Westbrook musicians were old-fashioned and boring, stuck in the past while the world moved forward. The truth, of course, was that both orchestras had incredibly talented young people. But nobody wanted to admit that anymore. By the time our story begins, things had reached a breaking point. If a Westbrook student saw an East Side student at the mall or in a coffee shop, they would turn and walk the other way. Parents from both sides refused to let their children attend the same summer music camps. Even the conductors, two middle-aged men who had once been classmates at the same music conservatory, now pretended the other didn't exist. The annual State Youth Orchestra Championship had become the main battlefield. Every spring, youth orchestras from across the state would gather in the capital city to compete for trophies and scholarships. For most groups, it was a celebration of young talent. For Westbrook and East Side, it was war. This is where our main character enters the story. He was a 17-year-old boy with messy black hair and hands that seemed too large for his thin wrists. His family had just moved to Riverdale 3 months ago, and he was still trying to figure out where he fit in. Back in his old town, he had been known as a piano prodigy. People said he played with a kind of emotion that made grown men cry. But here in Riverdale, nobody knew him yet. He was just a new kid who kept to himself and spent his lunch breaks in the music room. His grandmother had taught him to play piano when he was just 4 years old. She was a tiny woman with silver hair and gentle eyes. And she had lived through things that no person should ever have to experience. War, displacement, loss. But through all of it, she had held on to one thing, her music. Every afternoon, she would sit him down at the old upright piano in her living room. The keys were yellowed and some of them stuck, but to him, it was the most beautiful instrument in the world. She never pushed him to practice scales or memorize complicated pieces. Instead, she taught him to listen, to feel, to let the music flow through him like water through a river. Music is not about being better than someone else, she used to say, her wrinkled hand resting on his shoulder. Music is about connection. When you play, you are speaking a language that everyone understands. You are building a bridge. She passed away 2 years ago, just before his family started moving from city to city for his father's work. He still wore her thin silver bracelet on his wrist, hidden under his sleeve where no one could see it. And he still played the piano the way she taught him, with his whole heart open. When he enrolled at Riverdale Central High School, he quickly learned about the orchestra rivalry. It was impossible to avoid. Students wore their orchestra affiliations like badges of honor. In the hallways, he heard whispers and arguments. In his classes, he noticed how certain kids refused to sit next to each other. The whole thing confused him deeply. Why would anyone turn music into a reason to hate? Within his first week, both orchestras had heard about him. News travels fast in small cities, especially news about a talented pianist. The Westbrook conductor, a stern man with a gray beard and sharp eyes, approached him after school one day. He spoke about tradition, about discipline, about being part of something greater than yourself. He made it sound like joining Westbrook was the only respectable choice. 2 days later, the East Side conductor found him in the school parking lot. This man was younger, with slick-back hair and an expensive watch. He talked about innovation, about pushing boundaries, about the future of music. He promised opportunities and connections that could launch a career. Both men were passionate. Both men were persuasive. And both men made it very clear that choosing one orchestra meant becoming an enemy of the other. He didn't know what to do at night. He would sit at the keyboard in his small bedroom and play his grandmother's favorite songs. He thought about what she would say if she could see this situation. He imagined her shaking her head slowly, that disappointed look she used to get when people let their pride get in the way of something beautiful. As the weeks passed, he started paying closer attention to the students from both orchestras. He watched them in the cafeteria, in the hallways, at the local music store where everyone went to buy new strings and reeds. And he noticed something that made his heart ache. There was a girl in Westbrook who played the violin. She was maybe 15 or 16, with curly brown hair that she always tied back with a simple ribbon. When she practiced, and he had heard her through the windows of the community hall a few times, she played with this raw, almost desperate emotion. It reminded him of his grandmother. It was the sound of someone pouring their soul into their instrument. And then there was a boy in East Side who played the cello. He was tall and quiet, the kind of person who seemed to disappear into the background until he picked up his bow. His playing was different, more controlled, but underneath the technique was something real, something honest. When he played, you could tell he wasn't thinking about competitions or trophies. He was somewhere else entirely, lost in the music. These two students had probably never spoken a word to each other. If they passed on the street, they would look away, just like everyone else. And yet, listening to them play, he could tell they were the same. They both loved music for what it truly was, not for what it could win them. The rivalry was hurting them. It was hurting everyone. He started to feel a weight on his shoulders. It was strange, because he barely knew anyone in this town. He had no history here, no reason to care about a conflict that started long before he arrived. But somehow, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was supposed to do something. His grandmother used to tell him that some people are born to build bridges. At the time, he thought she was just being poetic. Now, sitting alone in his room with her bracelet on his wrist and her songs in his heart, he wondered if maybe she had been trying to tell him something more outside his window. The city of Riverdale went on with its ordinary life. People drove to work. Kids rode their bikes. Somewhere on the west side, the Westbrook Orchestra was rehearsing. Somewhere on the east side, the East Side Ensemble was doing the same, and in between them, a 17-year-old boy with messy black hair sat at his keyboard, playing a soft melody that nobody else could hear, wondering if one person could really make a difference in a world that seemed so determined to stay divided. He didn't have the answer yet, but something told him he was about to find out. The announcement came on a cold Tuesday morning in February. It arrived in the form of an email that was sent to every youth orchestra in the state, and within hours, it had turned the music world upside down. The State Youth Orchestra Championship was adding a new category this year. For the first time ever, There would be a collaborative performance competition. The rules were simple. 2 orchestras had to join together and perform a single piece as one unified group. The judges would be looking for harmony, teamwork, and the ability to blend different musical styles into something beautiful. It sounded wonderful on paper. The problem was, in the entire region around Riverdale, there were only 2 youth orchestras good enough to compete at the state level. And those 2 orchestras would rather set their instruments on fire than share a stage. The reaction was immediate and loud. At Westbrook, the conductor called an emergency meeting in the creaky community hall. He stood in front of his students with his arms crossed, his face twisted into a frown that made him look 10 years older. "We will not be participating in this ridiculous category," he declared. "Our orchestra has standards. We have pride. We do not need to lower ourselves by associating with those people." The students nodded along, because that was what they had been taught to do. But if you looked closely, you could see something else in some of their eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or disappointment. A few of them had secretly wondered what it would be like to play alongside the talented musicians from the other side of town. Meanwhile, at the East Side rehearsal space, a similar scene was unfolding. The younger conductor paced back and forth in front of the big glass windows, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor. "This is clearly a ploy to undermine serious musical programs," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Collaboration sounds nice in theory, but in practice, it means compromising our vision. And we do not compromise." Again, the students nodded. Again, some of them felt a small pang of something they couldn't quite name. The cellist, the tall, quiet boy who played with such honesty, stared at his instrument and said nothing. He had heard recordings of the Westbrook violinist. He knew how talented she was. Part of him had always wondered what it would sound like if their instruments played together, but he kept that thought to himself. In this world, thoughts like that were dangerous. The news spread through Riverdale Central High School like wildfire. In the hallways, students argued about the announcement. Some thought it was stupid. Others thought it was interesting but impossible. A few brave souls suggested that maybe, just maybe, the 2 orchestras could put aside their differences for one performance. Those students were quickly shut down. Our piano player heard all of this from the edges of conversations. He sat in the back of classrooms, walked through hallways with his head down, ate lunch alone in the music room. He was still an outsider, still trying to understand the depth of the hatred that had taken root in this town. But the more he learned, the more it bothered him. One afternoon, he found himself standing outside the Westbrook Community Hall. He hadn't planned to come here. His feet had just carried him while his mind was elsewhere. Through the dusty windows, he could see the orchestra rehearsing. The sound leaked through the old walls, muffled but still beautiful. And then he heard her. The violinist with the curly brown hair. She was playing a solo passage, and even through the glass and wood and distance, her music reached straight into his chest and grabbed hold of his heart. There was pain in her playing. There was longing. There was something that sounded almost like a cry for help. He stood there for a long time, just listening. The next day, he walked past the East Side rehearsal building. This time, it was intentional. He wanted to hear the cellist, to see if his playing matched what he remembered. The modern building had better soundproofing, but he found a spot near a side door where the music slipped through. The cellist was practicing something slow and melancholy. Each note hung in the air like a question waiting for an answer. There was no showing off, no technical tricks designed to impress. Just pure, honest emotion flowing through strings and wood. 2 incredible musicians. 2 people who clearly loved music with everything they had. And they were forbidden from ever playing together because of a fight that happened before they were even born. It made no sense to him. That night, he sat at his keyboard for hours. He didn't play anything complicated, just simple chords over and over, while his mind worked through the problem. His grandmother's bracelet felt heavy on his wrist. He could almost hear her voice in his ear, asking him questions the way she used to when he was stuck on something. What do you really want? What are you afraid of? What would happen if you were brave? The answers came slowly, like dawn breaking over a dark horizon. He wanted to see those two musicians play together. He wanted to see both orchestras discover what they could create if they stopped fighting. He wanted music to be what his grandmother always said it should be. A bridge, not a wall. He was afraid of rejection, of being laughed at, of making enemies in a town where he had barely made any friends. He was afraid of standing up and being noticed when all he really wanted was to blend into the background. But if he was brave, if he actually did something instead of just watching from the sidelines, maybe nothing would change. Maybe he would fail completely, but at least he would know that he tried. The following week, both conductors approached him again. It was almost funny how it happened. On Monday, the Westbrook conductor caught him after school and formally invited him to be the guest pianist for their competition piece. On Wednesday, the East Side conductor made the same offer. Both men spoke about what an honor it was, how his talent would elevate their performance, how this could be the start of a wonderful musical relationship. They expected him to be flattered. They expected him to say yes to one of them and no to the other. They expected him to pick a side, like everyone else in this town had done. Instead, he asked for a few days to think about it. He spent those days watching, listening, and planning. He observed how the rivalry affected the students on both sides. He saw the stress on their faces before competitions. He noticed how some of them flinched when they heard the other orchestra's name mentioned. This wasn't healthy competition. This was something that was eating away at young people who should have been enjoying the best years of their lives. On Saturday morning, he made 2 phone calls. One to the Westbrook conductor, one to the East Side conductor. He asked if they could meet him at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Both men agreed. Though they sounded confused, what they didn't know was that he had invited them at the same time dot when they walked into the coffee shop and saw each other. Their faces went through about 5 different expressions in 3 seconds. Surprise, anger, confusion, betrayal, and finally, reluctant curiosity as they both turned to look at the 17-year-old boy sitting calmly at a corner table with a cup of tea in front of him. "Please sit down," he said. His voice was quiet, but there was something steady in it that made both men listen. "I have something I want to say to both of you." They sat. They didn't look at each other, but they sat. He took a deep breath. His grandmother's bracelet pressed against his skin, giving him courage. "I know you both want me to play with your orchestras," he began, "and I'm honored by that. Really, I am. But I've been thinking about it, and I've made a decision." He paused, looking at each conductor in turn. "I'll only perform at the state championship if both orchestras enter the collaborative category together. If you agree to work with each other, I'll play piano for the combined group. If you don't agree, then I won't perform for either of you." The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. The Westbrook conductor's face turned red. The East Side conductor's jaw dropped open. For a moment, it seemed like they might both stand up and walk out, but our piano player wasn't finished. "I've heard your students play," he continued, his voice still calm but filled with conviction. "Both orchestras have incredible talent. The violinist at Westbrook plays with more emotion than anyone I've ever heard. The cellist at Eastside has a gift that most people never achieve in a lifetime. Imagine what they could create if they played together instead of against each other." He leaned forward slightly. "I know you have history. I know there's bad blood between your groups. But that history belongs to the past. The The students in your orchestras right now, they didn't start this rivalry. They inherited it. And I think some of them are tired of carrying it. Neither conductor spoke, but neither of them left either. My grandmother taught me that music is supposed to bring people together, he said quietly. She survived things that should have destroyed her, and music was the only thing that kept her whole. She used to tell me that every note played with genuine feeling is an act of healing. I believe that. And I think if we do this right, we could heal something that's been broken in this town for a very long time. He sat back in his chair and waited. The two conductors looked at each other for the first time in years. Something passed between them. A memory, maybe. A recognition of how far they had let things go. The Westbrook conductor spoke first, his voice gruff. This is impossible. The students will never agree. The parents will revolt. The East Side conductor nodded slowly. He's right. The logistics alone would be a nightmare. Where would we rehearse? Who would conduct? How would we divide the parts? But our piano player noticed something important. They were raising problems, not saying no. They were asking how, not refusing outright. And that meant there was hope. I don't have all the answers, he admitted. But I'm willing to work as hard as it takes to make this happen. Are you? Another long silence. Outside the coffee shop window, life in Riverdale continued as normal. Cars passed. People walked their dogs. Nobody knew that inside this little building, something was about to shift. Finally, the Westbrook conductor let out a heavy sigh. I must be losing my mind, he muttered. Then he looked at his old classmate, his rival, his enemy of 12 years. What do you say? Should we give this kid a chance to prove us wrong? The East Side conductor stared at the table for a long moment. Then, slowly and impossibly, he nodded. Fine, he said. But when this falls apart, don't say I didn't warn you. It wasn't enthusiastic. It wasn't hopeful. But it was a yes. And sometimes, that's all you need to start changing the world. The first joint rehearsal was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon in the Westbrook Community Hall. It was chosen as the location because it was larger, though the East Side conductor made it clear that he considered the building old and beneath his standards. Already, before a single note had been played, tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Students from both orchestras arrived separately. The Westbrook musicians came through the front door, moving to the left side of the room as if an invisible wall divided the space. The East Side students entered through a side entrance, filling up the right side. For several minutes, nearly 80 young people stood in awkward silence, staring at the floor or at their instruments, doing everything they could to avoid making eye contact with the enemy. Our piano player arrived early. He had helped set up the chairs and music stands, arranging them in a way that would force the two groups to mix together. But as he watched the students sort themselves into opposing camps, he realized that chairs meant nothing. The real walls were inside their heads. The two conductors stood at the front of the room, side by side but miles apart. The Westbrook conductor cleared his throat and raised his baton. The East Side conductor did the same with his own baton. And immediately, an argument erupted about who should actually lead the rehearsal. This is my hall, the Westbrook conductor said through clenched teeth. But my orchestra has more experience with contemporary pieces, the East Side conductor shot back. They went back and forth for nearly 10 minutes while the students watched in uncomfortable silence. Finally, someone suggested they take turns conducting different sections of the music. It was a clumsy solution, but it was the only way forward. The piece they had chosen was a complex orchestral arrangement that required every section to work together seamlessly. On paper, it was beautiful. In practice, it was a disaster. The strings couldn't agree on bowing technique. Westbrook players used longer, more traditional strokes, while East Side players preferred shorter, more aggressive movements. The result sounded like two different songs being played at the same time. The woodwinds had their own problems. A Westbrook flutist and an East Side clarinetist were supposed to play a duet passage together, but the clarinetist kept speeding up while the flutist slowed down. Neither would adjust to match the other. Even the percussion section fell apart. A simple cymbal crash was missed because the two students responsible were busy glaring at each other instead of watching the conductor. After 45 minutes, the East Side conductor threw his baton on the ground and announced he was leaving. A group of East Side students followed him toward the door. Parents who had been watching from the back of the room started shouting at each other. One Westbrook mother accused the East Side families of sabotaging the rehearsal. One Westbrook mother accused the East Side families of sabotaging the rehearsal. An East Side father yelled back that the Westbrook students were impossible to work with. It was chaos. Pure, ugly chaos. Our piano player sat frozen at the grand piano, his hands resting on the keys, his heart sinking with every angry word. He had pushed for this. He had convinced two stubborn men to try something they didn't believe in. And now it was falling apart exactly the way everyone had predicted. That night, he almost gave up. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the disaster in his mind. Maybe he had been naive. Maybe some divisions were too deep to bridge. Maybe his grandmother's philosophy about music and connection only worked in a world that no longer existed. But when morning came, he got up and made a decision. If the rehearsals weren't working, he would find another way. Over the next 2 weeks, he became a ghost moving between two worlds. He showed up early to Westbrook rehearsals, staying late to help students with their parts. He did the same at East Side, learning names and faces, asking questions about their musical backgrounds. He never pushed anyone to change their opinions. He just listened. Slowly, carefully, he started bringing small groups together outside of official rehearsals. 3 Westbrook violinists and 2 East Side violinists meeting in a practice room at the high school during lunch. A few brass players from both sides working through their shared passages after school in the band room. He told each group the same thing. This isn't about the competition. This is just about making music. Just this one piece. Just this one time. Not everyone agreed to participate. Some students refused to even consider sitting in the same room as their rivals. But enough of them said yes. Enough of them were curious. Enough of them were tired of the anger and wanted to see if something different was possible. The violinist with the curly brown hair was one of the hardest to convince. She had been a Westbrook loyalist her entire life. Her older brother had been concertmaster before her. Her parents were major donors to the orchestra. Joining any kind of collaboration felt like betraying her family, but she also felt something else. A restlessness that had been growing inside her for years. A sense that something was missing from her music, no matter how hard she practiced or how many solos she performed. She couldn't name it, but she could feel it. A kind of emptiness that trophies and applause never seemed to fill. So when the piano player asked if she would try playing one passage with someone from East Side, she hesitated. Her first instinct was to say no. But something in his eyes made her pause. There was no judgment there. No pressure. Just a quiet hope that reminded her of why she had started playing violin in the first place. "Fine," she said finally. "One passage. That's it." The cellist from East Side was easier to convince, but only slightly. He had always been the quiet one in his orchestra, the kind of person who preferred to let his music speak for him. He didn't care about rivalry or competition. He just wanted to play. When the piano player approached him with the idea of a small collaboration, he simply shrugged and said, "Sure, why not?" The meeting was arranged for a Wednesday evening in an empty classroom at the high school. Just the three of them. The piano player, the violinist, and the cellist. No conductors. No parents. No pressure. They set up their instruments in silence. The violinist kept glancing at the cellist like she expected him to attack her at any moment. The cellist seemed completely unbothered, tuning his strings with the same calm focus he always had. The piano player took his seat at the old upright piano in the corner of the room. It wasn't a great instrument, nothing like the grand piano at Westbrook, but it would do. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's try the passage from measure 47. The one where violin and cello are supposed to weave together." The violinist raised her bow. The cellist did the same. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the piano player began to play. A simple chord progression, just something to set the mood and establish the tempo. And slowly, hesitantly, the other two joined in. At first, it was awkward. The violinist played too fast, her nerves getting the better of her. The cellist lagged behind, unsure of how to match someone he had never worked with before. The sound was rough and unpolished, nothing like what they were capable of. But then something happened. The violinist took a breath and listened. Really listened. She heard the cello beneath her, deep and warm and grounding. Instead of fighting against it, she let herself settle into the sound. Her bow slowed down. Her tone softened. The cellist heard the change immediately. He responded, lifting his melody to meet hers. Their notes began to intertwine, rising and falling together like two birds flying in formation. The piano player kept playing, but his eyes were fixed on the two of them. He watched as their expressions changed. The tension in the violinist's shoulders melted away. A small smile appeared on the cellist's face, so brief you might have missed it if you blinked. And the music. The music was extraordinary, that it wasn't perfect. There were still rough edges, still moments where they stumbled. But underneath all of that, there was something rare and precious. A connection, a conversation. Two strangers discovering that they spoke the same language. When the passage ended, silence filled the room. Nobody moved. The last notes seemed to hang in the air, fading slowly like the final light of sunset. Then the violinist lowered her bow and looked at the cellist. Really looked at him, maybe for the first time ever. That was. She started, then stopped. She didn't have words for what she was feeling. The cellist nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said simply. It was. The piano player felt something unlock in his chest. This was it. This was what he had been hoping for. Not a grand gesture or a dramatic speech, but a small, quiet moment where two people realized they had more in common than they ever imagined. He knew one breakthrough wouldn't fix everything. There were still 80 musicians who needed to learn to work together. There were still two conductors who barely tolerated each other. There were still parents and traditions and years of built-up resentment. But now he had proof that it was possible. And more importantly, he had two allies. Over the next few weeks, word began to spread. The violinist told a few of her Westbrook friends about the experience. The cellist mentioned it to some of the younger East Side players. Slowly, cautiously, more students began showing up to the informal practice sessions. The official joint rehearsals still struggled. But they got a little better each time. A little less fighting. A little more listening. A little more of what music was supposed to be. The state championship was now just 3 weeks away. There was still so much work to do, so many wounds that needed healing, so many people who doubted that this crazy experiment could ever succeed. But for the first time since he arrived in Riverdale, our piano player allowed himself to believe that they might actually pull it off. And late at night, when he practiced alone in his room with his grandmother's bracelet on his wrist, he could almost feel her smiling down at him. The bridge was being built. One note at a time. The day of the State Youth Orchestra Championship arrived with gray skies and a cold wind that cut through jackets and scarves. Students from across the state poured into the grand auditorium in the capital city, carrying instrument cases and nervous energy. For most of them, this was the biggest performance of their young lives. For the combined Westbrook and Eastside Orchestra, it was something much more. The collaborative category was scheduled last, almost like the organizers wanted to save the most unpredictable event for the end. Throughout the day, individual orchestras performed their solo pieces, each one polished and precise. Judges scribbled notes. Parents clapped politely. Everything proceeded exactly as expected. But backstage, in a cramped warm-up room with flickering fluorescent lights, 80 young musicians were fighting a battle with their own doubts. I heard people laughing when they saw our names together on the program. A Westbrook trumpet player muttered, "They think we're going to humiliate ourselves." "Maybe they're right," an Eastside flutist replied, her voice tight with anxiety. "We've only had a few decent rehearsals. The rest were disasters." The negativity spread like a virus. Students who had started to believe in the collaboration began second-guessing themselves. Old tensions resurfaced. A Westbrook percussionist and an Eastside drummer got into an argument about who should sit closer to the front. For a moment, it seemed like weeks of progress were about to unravel. Our piano player stood near the door, watching the chaos unfold. His stomach churned with worry. He had pushed for this. He had convinced everyone to take this risk. And now, with less than an hour until their performance, the whole thing was falling apart. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to find the violinist standing beside him. Her curly brown hair was pulled back tighter than usual, and her face was pale. But there was something steady in her eyes. "They're scared," she said quietly, nodding toward the room full of arguing musicians. "That's all this is. They're terrified of failing in front of everyone." He nodded slowly. "So am I." She almost smiled. "Yeah, me too. But you know what? I'd rather fail trying to do something meaningful than succeed at something that doesn't matter." On his other side, the cellist appeared. His tall frame hunched slightly as he carried his instrument. "She's right," he said in his quiet way. "Whatever happens out there, at least we tried." That's more than anyone expected from us. Something shifted inside the piano player's chest. These two people, who had been strangers just weeks ago, who had been raised to see each other as enemies, were now standing beside him like old friends. If nothing else came from this whole experience, at least it had happened. At least 3 people had found each other across a divide that had seemed impossible to cross. But he wanted more. He wanted everyone to feel what the 3 of them had discovered. He walked to the center of the room and raised his hand. It took a moment, but gradually, the arguing stopped. 80 pairs of eyes turned toward him, most of them filled with doubt and fear and exhaustion. He didn't give a big speech. He didn't have any magic words that would suddenly fix everything. Instead, he just spoke from his heart. "I know you're scared," he said. "I know a lot of you still aren't sure this was the right choice. And I know some of you are angry at me, at each other, at this whole situation. But can I ask you to do something? Just for the next hour, forget about Westbrook. Forget about Eastside. Forget about the rivalry and the history and all the reasons we're supposed to hate each other." He paused, looking around the room at faces he had come to know over the past weeks. When we walk onto that stage, we're not 2 orchestras anymore. We're one. Just a bunch of kids who love music, trying to create something beautiful together. That's it. That's all we have to be. Silence. Then, from somewhere in the back, the Eastside cellist began to clap. Slowly, steadily, the Westbrook violinist joined in. Then a few others. Within seconds, the whole room was applauding. Not enthusiastically, not with wild excitement, but with something quieter and more important. Agreement, acceptance, a willingness to try. The 2 conductors, who had been standing in opposite corners, pretending the other didn't exist, exchanged a glance. Something passed between them, some remnant of the friendship they had shared decades ago before everything went wrong. The Westbrook conductor gave a small nod. The East Side conductor returned it. For tonight, at least, they were on the same team. When the time came, the combined orchestra walked onto the stage together. Not in two separate groups, not divided by invisible lines. Just one stream of young musicians, carrying their instruments, taking their seats in the formation they had finally agreed upon after endless arguments and compromises. The auditorium was packed. Word had spread about the unprecedented collaboration, and people had come from all over to witness what most believed would be a spectacular failure. In the front rows, parents from both orchestras sat in tense clusters, some of them still refusing to acknowledge each other. Judges sat at a long table near the stage, their faces carefully neutral. Somewhere in the back, reporters from local newspapers waited with cameras ready to capture whatever drama unfolded. Our piano player took his seat at the grand piano, center stage. The instrument was magnificent, all gleaming black wood and ivory keys, far better than anything he had ever played on before. He ran his fingers lightly over the keys, feeling their smooth coolness, steadying his breath. His grandmother's bracelet pressed against his wrist, hidden beneath his sleeve. He closed his eyes for just a moment and thought of her. Her gentle voice, her wrinkled hands guiding his across a different piano a lifetime ago, her unwavering belief that music could heal anything. This is for you, he thought. Whatever happens tonight, this is for you. The conductors took their position at the front of the orchestra. They had agreed to share the role, with the Westbrook conductor leading the first half of the piece and the East Side conductor taking over for the second half. It was an awkward arrangement, but it was the best they could do. The Westbrook conductor raised his baton. The auditorium fell silent. 1,000 people held their breath, and then the music began. The opening was tentative. You could hear the nervousness in the strings, the slight hesitation in the woodwinds. The sound was good, but it wasn't great. It was the sound of people still holding back, still afraid to fully commit. But then something started to change as the piece progressed. As the familiar passages they had practiced over and over again began to flow, the musicians started to relax. They stopped thinking about who was sitting next to them and started thinking about the music itself. Bows moved in unison. Breaths aligned. The two orchestras began to blend into one. Our piano player felt it happening. He could sense the shift in the air, the moment when 80 individuals became a single organism, breathing and pulsing together. His fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence, laying down the harmonic foundation that everything else rested upon. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The duet passage. Measure 40-7. The violinist raised her bow. Across the stage, the cellist did the same. Their eyes met for just a second, a brief acknowledgement of everything they had been through to get here. And then they played. The sound that emerged was unlike anything the auditorium had heard that day. The violin soared high and bright, carrying a melody full of longing and hope. The cello answered with rich, warm tones that grounded the music and gave it depth. They wove around each other, two voices having a conversation, challenging and supporting and lifting each other higher. The audience felt it. You could see it in the way people leaned forward in their seats, the way hands rose to cover mouths, the way eyes began to glisten with unexpected tears. This wasn't just good musicianship. This was something rare, something pure. Two young souls who had been taught to be enemies, discovering that they were meant to be partners. As the duet reached its peak, our piano player launched into his solo cadenza. This was the section he had practiced alone in his room, night after night, with his grandmother's bracelet on his wrist and her memory in his heart. He didn't play for the judges. He didn't play for the audience. He played for her. For the woman who had taught him that music was never about winning or losing. It was about connection. It was about healing. It was about building bridges across chasms that seemed impossible to cross. His fingers flew across the keys, pulling sounds from the instrument that seemed almost impossible. Notes cascaded and tumbled and soared, filling the auditorium with emotion so intense that it almost hurt to listen. Some people in the audience began to cry openly. Others gripped their seats, overwhelmed by what they were experiencing. And then, as the cadenza ended and the full orchestra rejoined him, everything came together perfectly. All 80 musicians played as one. The sound was enormous, powerful, overwhelming. It was the sound of walls crumbling. The sound of old wounds finally beginning to heal. The sound of something new and beautiful being born from years of anger and pain. The final chord rang out, filling every corner of the auditorium. Then it faded, slowly, like the last light of a sunset, and then silence. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The world seemed to stop. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the audience, someone started to clap. Another person joined. Then another. Within moments, the entire auditorium was on its feet, applauding with an intensity that shook the walls. Our piano player sat at the keyboard, his hands trembling, tears streaming down his face. He looked out at the standing crowd, at the judges who had abandoned their neutral expressions and were applauding along with everyone else, at the parents who had forgotten their feuds and were hugging strangers beside them. He looked at the violinist, who was clutching her instrument and crying, at the cellist, who was smiling wider than anyone had ever seen him smile, at the 2 conductors who stood side by side, bowing together like old friends. And somewhere, deep in his heart, he felt his grandmother's presence beside him, her gentle hand on his shoulder, her voice whispering in his ear, "You built the bridge, my boy. You built the bridge." When the judges announced that the combined orchestra had won first place in the collaborative category, the cheering was so loud that it echoed through the hallways outside the auditorium. Students from both Westbrook and Eastside rushed toward each other, hugging and laughing and crying all at once. In that moment, nobody remembered who belonged to which group. Nobody cared anymore, but the trophy, as shiny and impressive as it was, quickly became the least important part of what happened that night. Backstage, after the crowds had thinned and the excitement had settled into something quieter, former rivals sat together on the floor sharing snacks and phone numbers. A Westbrook clarinetist and an Eastside flutist, the same 2 who couldn't play together just weeks ago, were already making plans to practice duets over the summer. A group of brass players from both orchestras huddled in a corner, laughing at a video someone had taken during the performance. The 2 conductors stood near the exit, watching their students with expressions that were hard to read. Then the Westbrook conductor, the stern man with the gray beard, who had spent 12 years refusing to acknowledge his former friend, extended his hand. "We should have done this a long time ago," he said quietly. The Eastside conductor looked at the hand for a moment. Then he took it and shook it firmly. Better late than never. Before they parted ways that night, both men made an announcement to their combined students. Starting next year, there would be a new tradition. Every winter, the 2 orchestras would come together for a joint concert. Not a competition, not a battle, just a celebration of music and the community. They had finally started to rebuild. The applause that followed was different from the applause in the auditorium. It was smaller, more personal, filled with relief and gratitude and the kind of joy that comes when something broken finally starts to heal. Our piano player stood off to the side, watching it all unfold. The violinist found him there and stood beside him in comfortable silence. A moment later, the cellist joined them. The three of them didn't need to say anything. They just watched as the walls that had divided their town for over a decade continued to crumble. One conversation at a time. In the weeks that followed, life in Riverdale began to change. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. Old habits don't disappear overnight. Some parents still grumbled about the collaboration. Some students still felt awkward around their former rivals. But something had shifted. A door had been opened, and it couldn't be closed again. The violinist received a letter a few weeks after the championship. It was from the cellist, handwritten on simple notebook paper. He wrote that playing with her had reminded him why he fell in love with music in the first place. He had been thinking about quitting before the collaboration, exhausted by the pressure and the politics and the endless competition. But that night on stage, when their instruments had woven together like they were made for each other, he had found something he thought he had lost forever. She wrote back. She told him that she had felt the same emptiness, the same exhaustion. She told him that his cello had given her violin a foundation to stand on, and that she had never felt so supported in her entire musical life. They kept writing to each other throughout the summer, and by fall, they had become close friends. The piano player was offered scholarships and performance opportunities from several prestigious music programs. People called him a prodigy. They praised his technique and his emotional depth. But whenever interviewers asked him about his talent, he always talked about his grandmother instead. He told them about her silver bracelet, about the lessons she taught him on an old upright piano with yellowed keys, about her belief that music was meant to build bridges, not walls. A year later, something remarkable happened. A group of students from both Westbrook and Eastside, led by the violinist and the cellist, founded a new youth orchestra. They called it the Bridge Ensemble. There were no tryouts based on skill level, no rankings or competitions, no divisions between who was better or worse. Just young people who wanted to make music together, supporting each other, learning from each other, growing together. They asked our piano player to perform at their very first concert. On that evening, as he walked onto the stage of a small community center packed with families and friends, he felt a peace he had never experienced before. The orchestra behind him was filled with faces he recognized. Students who had once refused to sit in the same room were now sharing music stands and inside jokes. The violinist sat in the first chair, her curly brown hair tied back with the same simple ribbon she always wore. The cellist sat across from her, his tall frame relaxed, a small smile on his face. Our piano player took his seat at the piano. It wasn't a grand instrument like the one at the championship. It was simple and slightly out of tune in the upper register. But it was perfect. He looked out at the audience. He saw parents who had learned to let go of old grudges. He saw kids too young to remember the rivalry, who would grow up never understanding why anyone would choose hatred over harmony. He saw a community that was slowly, imperfectly, beautifully healing, and he saw something else too. In the empty seat in the front row, the one he had asked to be kept open, he felt a presence. A tiny woman with silver hair and gentle eyes. A woman who had survived the worst the world could offer and had still believed in the power of music to make things whole again. He touched the bracelet on his wrist one last time. Then he placed his hands on the keys and began to play. Some performances, he had learned, were never really about the music at all. They were about what the music could heal.